We're going to move on to talking about gas exchange. Before moving on, please pause this lecture and take a look at this video linked here. Dalton's law states that the total pressure of a mixture of gases equals the sum of the pressures of the individual gases. So what that means is also that the pressure of an individual gas can be derived by multiplying the total pressure of all the gases by the percentage of that gas within that mixture. So you should memorize the atmospheric pressure at sea level, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. In humid air, water vapor is going to dilute the contribution of other gases to the total pressure. For that reason, then to calculate the partial pressure of a gas in humid air, you have to first subtract the water vapor pressure from the total pressure. So for example, at 100% humidity and 25 degrees Celsius, water vapor pressure is 24. Okay. So then if you do the calculation, 760, which is the atmospheric pressure, minus the water vapor pressure, in this case 24, okay, and then multiply that number by 21% or 0.21. You should get 155 millimeters of mercury for the partial pressure of oxygen. At 100% humidity at 37 degrees Celsius, the water vapor pressure is 47. So then if you do that same calculation, 760 now minus 47, which is the water vapor pressure here, and then multiply that value by 0.21, you should get 150 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and for dry air, the water vapor pressure is close to 0, so it can then be neglected. And you can simply multiply the atmospheric pressure with the percent of gas in the atmosphere. So in this case, just multiply 760 times 0.21. You should get 160. Here's another practice that we can do. Now this problem assumes dry air. At sea level, we know the atmospheric pressure is 760. What is the partial pressure of oxygen? Okay, well, you multiply this number by 0.21, and then we get 159 or 160, right? Okay, now, at the top of Mount Everest, the atmospheric pressure is much less, okay? It's actually only 250 millimeters of mercury. Assuming this is dry air, then we multiply this value by the percent of oxygen in air, 21%, and we get 53. So you can see that even though oxygen is 21%, whether at sea level or at the top of Mount Everest, but the actual partial pressure of oxygen that the person experiences is largely dependent on the altitude. Here's a table that summarizes the gas laws that we've discussed in this lecture so far. So go over this table to make sure you understand all of these. Let's now take a closer look at external respiration. In this diagram, you'll notice that in the air that we inspire, the partial pressure of oxygen is 160. Partial pressure of CO2 is 0.3. And yet, when this air arrives in our alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is now only 104. And the partial pressure of CO2 has risen to 40. Well, why is this? The reason for this is because alveolar gas contains a lot more CO2 and water vapor than the atmospheric air, okay? And this is due to a number of factors, one of which is gas exchange in lungs. So while oxygen diffuses from alveoli into capillary, we also have CO2 diffusing out of capillary into alveoli. Okay, so this contributes to the lower PO2 and higher partial pressure of CO2. Another reason contributing to this is the humidification of air by conducting passages. So the conducting zone structures humidify the air. So for that reason, we now have to account for water vapor pressure as well. Okay, so now with water vapor accounted for, our partial pressure of oxygen is going to be lower. Okay, and yet another reason is that the mixing of alveolar gas with each breath. So newly inspired air mixes with air that was left in the passage between breaths. Okay. You'll also notice that the partial pressure of oxygen within alveoli being 104, while the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood entering lungs is only 40. Okay. And this steep concentration gradient, the steep partial pressure gradient is what drives the movement of oxygen from alveoli into the capillary. Okay. And if you look at the partial pressure for CO2 in alveoli versus the one found in the capillary, you'll notice that the gradient, the partial pressure gradient, is less steep. Okay. However, CO2 is able to diffuse just as well across that membrane, respiratory membrane. Well, why is that? It turns out it's because carbon dioxide is dozens folds more soluble in plasma and alveolar fluid than oxygen. So because it's able to, because of its structure, molecular structure, and being much more soluble in plasma and alveolar fluid, it allows it to readily cross that respiratory membrane, even with less steep of a partial pressure gradient. Internal respiration involves capillary gas exchange happening at body tissues. And in internal respiration, gas exchange is once again driven by differences in partial pressures. However, now our partial pressures and diffusion gradients are now reversed compared to external respiration. Okay. We can see that for the blood entering into tissue capillaries, the partial pressure of oxygen is 100. Partial pressure of oxygen inside the tissues is less than 40 because there's active cellular respiration going on, consuming the oxygen and producing CO2 actively. Okay, and now with this steep partial pressure gradient, okay, this promotes oxygen diffusing from inside the vessels to inside the tissue. Okay. Or CO2 is the opposite because there's active cellular processes making CO2. So the partial pressure of CO2 is higher in the tissues than inside the capillaries. For that reason, this promotes CO2 diffusing from tissue into the capillary. Moving on to talking about gas transport. Recall this image from the blood lecture. Nearly 99% of oxygen in your blood travels by binding to hemoglobin. And each hemoglobin molecule is comprised of 4 polypeptide chains, 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. Each polypeptide chain has an iron-containing heme group. And that iron in the center of the heme group can bind to oxygen. So that means each hemoglobin molecule can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules. In the bound state, the hemoglobin is called oxyhemoglobin. And its reduced hemoglobin state, that hemoglobin after it's released the oxygen, is now called deoxyhemoglobin. And so the loading and unloading of oxygen from the hemoglobin is facilitated by a change in the shape of hemoglobin. Okay. So now we're gonna look more closely at this process of facilitation. Now we can study the physical relationship between a partial pressure of oxygen and the binding of hemoglobin to it in vitro. Okay. And we can then plot this into what's known as oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, or also called oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. On the x-axis, we have partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. So we can vary the level of partial pressure of oxygen and then see how that affects how much of the oxygen that the hemoglobin can bind. In other words, it's saturation. And so the shape of this oxyhemoglobin saturation curve reflects the properties of hemoglobin molecules, as well as affinity for oxygen. Now, if you look at this curve, you'll find that at normal alveolar and arterial partial pressure of oxygen, around 100, 98% of the hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. So in other words, as the blood is passing through lungs under normal conditions, hemoglobin will readily pick up nearly the maximum amount of oxygen that it can possibly carry. Notice also that the curve is nearly flat at partial pressure of oxygen above 100. This means that at partial pressure of oxygen above 100, even large changes in partial pressure of oxygen will cause only minor changes in the percent saturation. Okay. This flat part of the saturation curve also means that the partial pressure of oxygen in alveoli can fall a good bit below 100 without significantly lowering the hemoglobin saturation. And as long as partial pressure of oxygen in alveoli and thus in the pulmonary capillaries stays above 60, you can see that we can maintain a 90% saturation and also maintain a near normal level of oxygen transport to the tissues. However, once partial pressure of oxygen falls below 60, the curve now becomes steeper. And that steep slope means that a small decrease in partial pressure of oxygen will now cause a relatively large release of oxygen. So what is the physiological significance of this saturation curve? Well, this curve shows that in blood leaving systemic capillaries with partial pressure of oxygen around 40, which is the average value for venous blood in someone who is resting, the hemoglobin is still 75% saturated. That means at the cells, when someone's at rest, the blood releases only a quarter of the oxygen it's capable of carrying. And the oxygen that remains bound to the hemoglobin can serve as a reservoir that the cells can draw on should the metabolic need increase. Okay. And when your tissues now demand more oxygen, such as when you start to exercise, okay, when you are exercising, that partial pressure of oxygen can fall to 20 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and you can see the hemoglobin saturation now falls to about 35. So from resting, that partial pressure of oxygen being 40, you can see saturation is around 75%. And then when you start to exercise, okay, the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin is now around 35. So that means that reservoir of additional oxygen on the hemoglobin allowed for an additional 40% of release when the situation calls upon it. So this is a very good example of a built-in reserve capacity of our body. Now that we've discussed the transport of oxygen in our blood, we're going to move on to talking about the transport of carbon dioxide in our blood. Carbon dioxide is transported in 3 forms in our blood. less than 10% of it is directly dissolved in plasma, okay, generating that partial pressure of CO2. About a fifth of it, or around 20% of it, is bound to the globin part of hemoglobin. And when CO2 binds to hemoglobin, that hemoglobin is known as carbamyl hemoglobin. The majority of carbon dioxide is actually transported in the form of bicarbonate. And the formation of bicarbonate occurs primarily within red blood cells, because as you can see, when it occurs in plasma, the formation of it is not catalyzed by an enzyme, so it's slow. However, within red blood cells, we can find these enzymes called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase allows the rapid conversion of CO2 and water to carbonic acid. This carbonic acid can then dissociate readily to bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. Okay. And so this, and then we also have transport proteins that allows for the exchange of bicarbonate out of the cell for every chloride that enters into the cell. And this process is called the chloride shift. And so in systemic capillaries, after that bicarbonate is created, it quickly diffuses from red blood cells into the plasma. And that outrush of bicarbonate from red blood cells is balanced as the chloride ion moves into the red blood cell from the plasma to counterbalance the negative electrical charge. And this process, as we mentioned, is called the chloride shift. In pulmonary capillaries, this process occurs in reverse. We have bicarbonate ions moving into red blood cells, while chloride ion moves out of red blood cells back into the plasma. Okay, and bicarbonate will then combine with hydrogen ion to create carbonic acid, which then gets converted to CO2 and H2O. And this process is also catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. So carbonic anhydrase reversibly and rapidly catalyzes this reaction in both directions. Okay, and now that we have CO2 and H2O formed, the CO2 can then diffuse out, and with the CO2 partial pressure lower in the alveoli, the CO2 in blood will then readily diffuse across the respiratory membrane into the alveoli, and then you then breathe out the CO2. Let's now take a look at carbon monoxide transport. So the transport of carbon monoxide is obviously not something that's normal, but it's something that can happen when you have carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide actually binds to hemoglobin at the same site as oxygen, but with 210 times the affinity compared to oxygen. And when it's bound to carbon monoxide, it forms the carboxy hemoglobin. Typically, oxygen would bind to hemoglobin in the lungs and then be released in areas where there's lower partial pressure of oxygen, such as at the tissues. But when carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, it cannot be released as easily as oxygen. So it will hold on to the hemoglobin and occupy that hemoglobin, preventing oxygen from occupying it. And the slow release rate of carbon monoxide causes an accumulation of carbon monoxide bound hemoglobin molecules as exposure to the carbon monoxide continues. And because of this, fewer hemoglobin particles are now available to bind and deliver oxygen. And this causes a gradual suffocation associated with the carbon monoxide poisoning.